Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there is this comforting expectation of absolute precision.
Right, yeah, like a clear-cut answer.
Exactly, like you break your arm, the x-ray shows that jagged white line, and the doctor just points at the film and says, there it is, that is the problem.
Broken or not broken, it's a clean binary system.
Yeah, we desperately like things to be visible and easily categorized, but then you step into the world of human history, specifically the deep subterranean history of human thought and belief, and suddenly that x-ray machine is completely useless.
Oh, it's entirely useless. You're looking at a landscape of ideas that is just incredibly murky.
Right, and specifically today we are looking at how ancient fragmented clay tablets from Mesopotamia didn't just, invent human ethics, but somehow thousands of years later they became the foundational basis for today's most viral internet conspiracies about extraterrestrial architects.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. I mean, we are looking at texts that have been buried in sand for millennia, translated across dead languages, and then reinterpreted by modern minds carrying their own immense biases.
Which is the perfect setup for our mission today. So if you are listening to this, you are stepping into a time machine aimed at the deepest roots of human civilization.
A very deep dive.
Exactly. We're pulling from a towering stack of sources, so peer-reviewed research papers, linguistic analyses, and direct translations of ancient cuneiform tablets. And we're using all of that to map out how our earliest ancestors in ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Levant figured out the concepts of law, their place in the cosmos, and, the very invention of right and wrong.
We are essentially reverse engineering the origin story of human software. Like, how did the human animal actually learn to operate collectively?
Yeah, and we are going to trace how those ancient Sumerian, Babylonian, and Egyptian operating systems literally laid the architectural groundwork for the world's major monotheistic religions.
Because the parallels between these clay tablets and texts like the Hebrew Bible and the Quran are just staggering once you lay them side by side.
Oh, absolutely staggering. But as we mentioned with the broken x-ray machine, we're also going to confront a bizarre modern mutation of this history.
Right, the alien theories.
Yeah, we're going to examine how these exact same cuneiform texts gave rise to the massive ancient alien astronaut theories dominating social media right now. So we'll impartially analyze the texts, the physical artifacts, and the linguistic claims to separate, profound historical truth from modern pseudoscience.
And before we begin, I think it is vital to establish our parameters here.
Yes, definitely.
Our objective is not to validate or invalidate any modern theological framework, nor to critique anyone's personal faith. We are analyzing these ancient sources strictly through the academic lenses of history, comparative linguistics, and archaeology.
Right, we're just observing how massive cultural memories evolved and influenced subsequent civilizations. No taking sides, just a relentless pursuit of the historical record.
Exactly.
So let us set the stage physically and psychologically. Picture the transition happening roughly between the 12th and 10th millennia BCE.
A massive shift.
Right. For countless generations prior, human beings were nomadic. We moved in small, egalitarian hunter-gatherer bands. You knew every single person in your tribe.
Yeah, but then the climate shifts, the agricultural revolution begins, and the domestication of grain and livestock takes hold. People start putting down permanent roots.
And that changes everything.
It fundamentally shatters the existing social dynamic. I mean, by the end of the 4th millennium BCE, you have the rise of the Great River civilizations Mesopotamia, situated between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and Egypt, thriving along the Nile.
Right, and we see the construction of monumental architecture, the standardization of pottery, and most crucially, the invention of writing.
Yes, the psychological shock of this cannot be overstated.
I mean, think about it. You go from living in a band of 50 people where resources are shared to living in the walled city-state of Uruk with tens of thousands of absolute strangers.
It's a completely alien environment.
Yeah. The noise, the sanitation issues, the competition for resources. It must have felt like standing on the edge of chaos every single day. Like, how do you convince 10,000 people who don't know each other to not burn the city to the ground over a stolen loaf of bread?
That is the defining crisis of early civilization. When sheer social proximity reaches a critical mass, tribal bonds are no longer sufficient to maintain order.
Because you can't just rely on familial shame anymore.
Exactly. You have to invent an external, objective system of ethics and authority.
Yeah.
You have to invent a mechanism that governs behavior even when no one is looking.
Which brings us to our first major exploration, which is the invention of ethics and the quest for meaning. Because the Mesopotamians did not solve this crisis by convening a democratic assembly and drafting a secular constitution.
No, not at all. The solution was entirely theological.
Yeah.
To comprehend the origins of these mythologies, you have to look at the practical, brutal reality of the earliest Mesopotamian cities. The city-state was not a secular entity. It was quite literally considered the physical real estate property of a specific local deity.
Our sources use an incredibly illuminating analogy here. If you want to understand a Mesopotamian city-state, you have to picture a modern, rigid corporate hierarchy.
I love this analogy.
It's so good. So the local god is the silent, incredibly powerful founder and majority shareholder of the corporation. The local human ruler, the king, is merely the CEO.
Right. The CEO does not own the company. He is a steward appointed by the founder to manage the assets and ensure the quarterly profits, which in this case are agricultural surplus and sacrifices, keep flowing upward.
The analogy holds up under intense scrutiny because it explains the function of the citizenry. The people living in the city were not citizens with inherent rights.
No, they were the employees of this divine corporation.
Yeah, their entire collective job description was to labor in the fields, maintain the irrigation canals, and build the temples to keep the founder, the god, comfortable, wealthy, and appeased.
And that structural reality completely redefines how law was perceived. When the king issued a decree, it was not secular legislation open to debate. It was a memo directly from the founder.
It was divinely revealed.
Exactly. We see this explicitly in the famous Code of Hammurabi from Babylon, dating around 1728 to 1646 BCE. Everyone knows the phrase, an eye for an eye, the lex talionis.
Right.
But when you read the actual source text, you see that justice was not some blindfolded ideal weighing truth on a scale. Justice was entirely dependent on your pay grade within the corporation.
Which is wild. The Mesopotamians referred to justice as the straight thing, implying order and correct alignment. But the application of that alignment was ruthlessly stratified by social class.
It was. The sources provide a clinical example regarding medical malpractice. Imagine a surgeon performs an operation using a bronze lancet on a nobleman, a man of high standing.
Good.
And the operation fails catastrophically, resulting in the nobleman's death or the loss of his eye. The legal penalty was the severing of the surgeon's hand.
Wow. A visceral, physical retribution. But if that exact same surgeon, making the exact same medical error, operates on a slave.
The penalty shifts from bodily mutilation to property replacement.
Wait, really?
Yeah. If the slave dies, the surgeon is obligated to provide the owner with a new slave. If the slave is blinded, the surgeon pays the owner half of the slave's market value in silver.
So the value of a human life is reduced to a line item on a ledger, based entirely on status.
Exactly. It's purely economic.
So we have this pressure cooker environment. You live in a crowded, noisy city. You are essentially a low-level employee working for an invisible god. If you make a mistake, the laws are violently unforgiving.
It's a bleak existence.
It really is. So where does the average person, or even the king, find any personal psychological meaning in a system designed to treat them as expendable machinery?
That existential crisis is the beating heart of one of the oldest and most profound pieces of literature ever discovered.
The Epic of Gilgamesh.
Yes. Gilgamesh is a historical figure, a 3rd millennium BCE king of Uruk, but the epic portrays him as a semi-divine, larger-than-life hero. However, he does not begin the story as a benevolent ruler. He begins as a tyrant, a catastrophic CEO.
Yeah, he is exhausting his subjects. The text describes him forcing the young men into constant labor or warfare and claiming the right of the first night to sleep with brides before their husbands.
Right, he is ruling through sheer, unbridled physical dominance, creating the very chaos the city system was designed to prevent.
And the populace cries out to the gods for relief from their own king.
And in response, the gods do not destroy Gilgamesh, they create a counterweight. They create Enkidu, a wild man of the steppe, who is meant to be Gilgamesh's physical and spiritual equal.
So Enkidu is brought to the city, they clash in a massive wrestling match, and upon realizing they are evenly matched, they form this inseparable bond.
Yeah, they channel their aggressive energy into heroic, monster-slaying expeditions away from the city.
But the turning point of the epic, and honestly one of the most significant turning points in recorded human consciousness, happens when they offend the gods, and the gods decree that Enkidu must die.
And Gilgamesh, this invincible, arrogant king, has to sit and watch his equal wither away and die. And it breaks him.
Completely shatters his entire worldview. Gilgamesh looks at his friend's corpse and realizes that all his political power, All his physical strength and all his divine lineage offer absolutely zero protection against mortality.
He is seized by a paralyzing terror of death. He abandons his throne, strips off his royal garments, puts on animal skins, and flees into the wilderness on a desperate, frantic quest to find the secret to eternal life.
He is looking for a loophole in the human condition.
Exactly. And this journey brings him to an alehouse at the edge of the world where he meets a barmaid.
And the advice this barmaid gives him is stunningly pragmatic. She looks at this filthy, grieving, frantic king, and she delivers a philosophy of life that resonates just as powerfully today as it did 4,000 years ago.
Oh, the text of her advice is preserved in the sources, and it is a masterpiece of ancient existentialism. She tells him, "Gilgamesh, where are you running? You won't find the immortal life you are seeking. When the gods created humankind, they ordained death for humans and retained immortality for themselves."
Just a brutal reality check.
And then she offers the alternative. She says, "So Gilgamesh, let your belly be full, be merry every day and night, make each day a day of joy, dance, play, wear clean clothes, let your head be washed and your body bathed with water, cherish the little child who grasps your hand, let your wife rejoice in your arms, for this is the destiny of mankind."
It is an ancient call to mindfulness. She is essentially saying, the system is rigged, you're going to die, so stop obsessing over the finish line and pay attention to the meal in front of you.
It is a beautiful, hedonistic, day-to-day value system, but Gilgamesh refuses to accept it.
Right, his ego cannot accept the finality of the grave. He pushes past her and eventually locates Utnapishtim, the ancient survivor of a great flood, who was granted immortality by the gods.
And Utnapishtim essentially tells Gilgamesh that his quest is futile, but he takes pity on him and reveals the location of a plant of rejuvenation at the bottom of the sea.
A literal fountain of youth. Gilgamesh ties rocks to his feet, dives into the deep, retrieves the plant, and he is ecstatic. He has the prize.
But then...
he begins the long journey back to Uruk. But along the way, he stops to bathe in a cool pool of water. He leads the plant on the shore, and while he is distracted, a snake slithers out of the reeds, eats the plant, sheds its skin, and disappears.
A classic etiological myth. A story designed to explain a natural phenomenon, in this case, why snakes shed their skin and appear to be endlessly rejuvenated.
But the philosophical implication for Gilgamesh is devastating. He sits down by the pool and weeps. The ultimate prize was right in his hands, and he lost it to a mindless reptile.
So he returns to his city, empty-handed. But the way the epic concludes is where the true ethical shift occurs. He doesn't return to Uruk and burn it down in a nihilistic rage.
No, the final lines of the epic have Gilgamesh walking up to the massive fired brick walls of Uruk. He points them out to his ferrymen, admiring the masonry of the foundation, the sheer scale of human achievement.
The ethical realization here is incredibly mature. Gilgamesh accepts that literal immortality is impossible. He also rejects the barmaid's purely hedonistic escape. He finds meaning in what scholars call the work ethic.
The idea that your legacy is the infrastructure you leave behind.
Precisely that concept. He realizes that his purpose is to serve the community, to fulfill his responsibilities as a leader, and to maintain the walls that will protect future generations long after he is dust.
The meaning of life is not found in escaping death, but in contributing to the continuity of civilization. That is a gritty, boots-on-the-ground philosophy.
It makes perfect sense for a society living between two unpredictable flooding rivers.
But if we shift our focus geographically, the sources reveal a completely different approach to the same problem. Let's look at Egypt. The Egyptian worldview was fundamentally distinct from the Mesopotamian realism we just discussed.
Because the geography dictated the psychology. Egypt was relatively isolated, protected by deserts, with a highly predictable, gentle flooding of the Nile that brought reliable prosperity.
Right.
Consequently, they did not rely on rigid, reactionary legal codes like Hammurabi's to govern every minor infraction. They relied on a much more abstract, all-encompassing cosmic concept known as Maat.
That is spelled M-A-A-T. Maat was not just a list of rules, it was the invisible fabric holding the universe together.
Exactly. It represented truth, balance, order, and justice. Maat was established by the creator gods at the dawn of time to hold back the forces of chaos.
And the primary job of the pharaoh was not just to enforce laws, but to actively maintain Maat. If society lived in harmony with this cosmic balance, the Nile flooded predictably and the crops grew.
But if society violated Maat, the universe itself would tilt toward chaos.
And the mechanism enforcing this behavior was radically different. The Mesopotamians believed the afterlife was just a dark, dusty cavern where everyone, king and peasant alike, ended up eating dirt.
Yeah, there was no reward for good behavior after you died in Mesopotamia.
Right, but for the Egyptians, the afterlife was the ultimate motivator. It was an intense, high-stakes judicial process.
We see this vividly detailed in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, particularly chapter 125. The Egyptians believed that upon death, the deceased would enter the Hall of Two Truths.
Oh, this part is fascinating.
There, they would face a tribunal of 42 terrifying divine judges, and the deceased had to perform what is known as the negative confession.
Right, they didn't stand up and brag about all the great things they did. They had to systematically deny committing 42 specific sins.
They had to address each judge and declare, for example, I have not committed robbery, I have not stolen grain, I have not uttered lies, I have not caused anyone to weep, I have not killed, I have not stopped the flow of water.
It's a fascinating inversion. You prove your alignment with Marat by proving your absence of chaos. And then came the physical test, the weighing of the heart.
The god Anubis would place the deceased heart on a massive scale, balanced against the feather of Ma'at. The heart represented the conscience and the record of the person's deeds.
So what happens if they fail?
Well, if the heart was heavy with sin and guilt, the scale tipped and the heart was instantly devoured by Amit, a monstrous deity with the head of a crocodile, the torso of a lion, and the hindquarters of a hippopotamus.
Yikes.
Yeah, that resulted in the permanent cessation of existence. But if the heart was light, perfectly balanced with truth, the person was welcomed into a beautiful, eternal paradise.
A system like that, where eternal paradise or permanent annihilation hangs on your daily moral choices, creates an incredibly powerful engine for social compliance.
Oh, incredibly powerful.
But I want to push back on the idea that every single person in Egypt was walking around in a constant state of pious terror. Because our sources highlight a piece of text that suggests a vibrant counterculture existed even in the shadow of the pyramids.
You are referring to the Harpist Song, which provides a crucial counterbalance to the Book of the Dead. Human skepticism is not a modern invention. It is as old as human faith.
Exactly. The Harpist Song was a piece of entertainment sung by musicians at wealthy Egyptian banquets. And the lyrics are completely subversive.
The harpist essentially tells the guests, look around at the tombs of the ancient, mighty pharaohs. Their walls are crumbling, their graves have been robbed, and they are gone as if they never existed.
No one has ever come back from the dead to tell us what it's actually like over there.
Right. The harpist is actively challenging the religious orthodoxy. The song advises the listeners to abandon their anxiety about the afterlife. It says, follow your desires as long as you live. Put myrrh on your head and wear fine linen. Satisfy your earthly needs until your day of mourning comes.
Because, the song concludes, you cannot take your property with you, and all your lamentations will not save a single man from the grave. It sounds almost exactly like the barmaid talking to Gilgamesh.
It really does. It proves that even in a culture entirely obsessed with preparing for death, there were deep thinkers pointing out the lack of empirical evidence, arguing that we should maximize the joy of the present moment because the future is a void.
It establishes a profound philosophical tension that runs through the entirety of human history. Like, do we optimize our behavior for the tangible present, or do we sacrifice the present to optimize our standing in a hypothetical eternity?
That tension is the perfect bridge to our next section.
Yeah, let's get into section 2. We have looked at how Egypt used the cosmic, invisible concept of Ma'at to guide society. But the Sumerians, being the pragmatic city builders they were, had a much more specific, almost mechanical way of quantifying civilization. They had something called the me.
Spelled M-E, pronounced May. The concept of the me is one of the most fascinating and bizarre intellectual constructs of the ancient world.
If we think of the universe as a giant computer, how would you define the me?
If the universe is the hardware, the me are the foundational kernel code. They are the fundamental decrees, the essential attributes, and the specific technologies that make civilization possible.
Wow, okay.
According to Sumerian mythology, they were established by the gods at the creation of the world. Initially, they were gathered and hoarded by Enlil, the supreme god, and then entrusted to Enki, the god of wisdom, freshwater, and magic, who stored them in his temple in the city of Eridu.
And what makes them so bizarre is that the myths treat these abstract concepts as if they are physical objects. They aren't just ideas floating in the ether. They're items that can be collected, worn as garments, loaded onto a boat, or put on display.
They possess a tangibility that is really hard for the modern mind to grasp. The most vivid illustration of this tangibility is found in the myth of Inanna and Enki. Inanna was the ambitious, powerful goddess of love, war, and the patron deity of the city of Uruk.
This is essentially the world's oldest heist movie.
It really is.
Inanna wants to elevate the political and cultural dominance of her city, Uruk. But to do that, she needs the May, which are sitting in Enki's vault in Eridu. So she boards her boat of heaven and sails down to Enki's city. Enki, seeing her arrive, prepares a massive banquet.
And Inanna uses this opportunity to execute a highly calculated plan. She engages Enki in a drinking contest. As the banquet progresses, Enki becomes heavily intoxicated. His judgment is entirely compromised.
Right.
In his drunken, expansive state, he begins to offer the May to Inanna, decree by decree.
He's literally handing over the source code of civilization because he's had too much beer. She takes them, loads them onto her boat, and immediately sets sail for Uruk.
When Enki eventually awakens from his stupor, he experiences a moment of divine panic. He realizes his vault is empty. He dispatches his minister, Isamud, along with various sea monsters, to intercept Inanna's boat and reclaim the May.
But she fights them off. She successfully docks Uruk, unloads the May, and presents them to her people, establishing Uruk as the new center of cultural and political power.
It's a mythological explanation for a very real historical shift in dominance between Mesopotamian cities.
But here is the critical part for our understanding of their psychology. What exactly was on that boat? We actually have fragmentary tablets listing these May, right?
We do. Scholars have identified over 60 distinct May from the surviving texts. And the inventory is a startling reflection of the ancient mind.
Many of them are exactly what you would expect a society to value. You have the Me of truth, kingship, law, peace, the craft of the builder, and scribeship, the noble pillars of society.
You also have highly specific cultural elements such as music, various musical instruments, and specific priestly offices and rituals.
But then you keep reading the list, and you encounter the shadow side. Alongside truth and peace, the gods also decreed the Me of prostitution, falsehood, enmity, fear, terror, strife, weariness, and shockingly, the destruction of cities.
This inclusion of catastrophic negatives is paramount to understanding Sumerian philosophy. Modern Western thought often equates the ideal civilization with a utopia, a theoretical state where all disease, crime, and suffering have been engineered out of existence. We view the negative aspects of life as bugs in the system that need to be patched.
But the Sumerians viewed those negatives as features of the system.
Precisely. The Sumerians were profound realists. They recognized that the human experience is an indivisible package. You cannot possess the craft of the builder without eventually experiencing the destruction of cities.
Right.
You cannot have the concept of truth without the counterweight of falsehood. They believed that the dark, destructive, and exhausting elements of life were not accidents or the result of human failure. They were divinely ordained me. They were deliberately coded into the operating system of the world by the gods.
That implies a level of psychological maturity that is almost intimidating. It's an acknowledgement that you cannot simply amputate the darkest parts of human nature without crashing the entire program. You have to learn to manage the whole package.
Absolutely.
So we have these incredible, highly developed philosophical concepts. The realism of Gilgamesh, the cosmic balance of Ma'at, the packaged dualities of the meat. But these ideas did not simply evaporate when Babylon fell or when the pharaohs died out.
They did not. They seeped into the groundwater of human culture. They became the foundational architectural blueprints for the texts of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
This brings us to section 3, Echoes in Eternity. The way these ancient polytheistic myths shaped monotheism is staggering. Let's start with the ultimate beginning, the creation of the universe. If we look at the Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, how does it all start?
Well, it begins not with a void, but with chaotic primordial waters. These waters are personified as two massive divine entities, the freshwater, Apsu, and the churning, chaotic saltwater, Tiamat, who is often depicted as a monstrous dragon.
These two waters mingle, creating younger generations of gods. But the younger gods are loud, they're chaotic. Apsu decides he wants to kill them so he can get some sleep.
Right, and the younger gods find out, preemptively kill Apsu, and this absolutely enrages Tiamat. She spawns an army of horrifying monsters to exact revenge. The younger gods are terrified until a champion emerges, the god Marduk.
And Marduk agrees to fight Tiamat, but only on the condition that he is elevated to the supreme kingship over all the gods. They agree. Marduk engages Tiamat in cosmic combat. He shoots an arrow down her throat, slays her, and then performs a brutal act of creation.
He splits her colossal watery corpse in half. From the upper half of her body, he constructs the dome of the heavens, and from the lower half, he forms the earth.
It is creation through supreme violence. But where do human beings enter this picture? Because the Sumerian and Babylonian texts provide a very specific origin story for humanity, and it revolves around a labor dispute.
Yes. In texts like the Atrahasis epic and the myth of Enki and Ninmah, we learn that prior to the creation of humans, the universe was divided into a class system of gods.
Right.
The high gods, the Anunnaki, ruled, while a lesser class of gods, the Igigi, were forced to do all the heavy physical labor.
The Igigis were the blue-collar workers of the cosmos. They were digging the Tigris and Euphrates rivers by hand.
Exactly. And eventually the physical toll became too great. The Igigi went on strike. The texts describe them literally setting fire to their tools and marching on the temple of the high god Enlil in the middle of the night. It is the first recorded labor strike in human literature.
Which is amazing. And it causes a cosmic supply chain crisis. The gods need agriculture to survive, and no one is farming. So, Enki, the god of wisdom, comes up with an engineering solution. What is his recipe for a new workforce?
Enki, collaborating with a mother goddess figure, decides to create a biological automaton, the human being. The recipe is highly symbolic. They take clay, the physical dirt of the earth, and they mix it with the blood of a rebel god who was slain for his role in the uprising.
So they bind the divine consciousness, the blood, to the earthly material, the clay, to create a creature smart enough to follow instructions but bound to the physical realm.
Yeah, the sole purpose of humanity in this view was to carry the baskets, dig the canals, and feed the gods so they could live a life of leisure.
It is a deeply utilitarian, almost cynical view of human worth. But if we observe how this narrative echoes into the monotheistic texts, the transformation is breathtaking. Let's look at the Hebrew Bible, the book of Genesis. The opening verses describe a universe beginning with the Spirit of God hovering over the deep, dark, chaotic waters.
It is an immediate parallel. In fact, our sources note that the Hebrew word used for the deep ocean there, Tiham, shares an ancient etymological root with the name Tiamat.
Oh, wow.
But instead of a violent battle with a chaos dragon, the Hebrew god simply speaks, taming the waters, separating the waters above from the waters below to create the sky and the dry land. It is a demythologized, orderly version of Marduk splitting Tiamat.
And when we reach the creation of humanity in Genesis 2, the physical mechanics remain remarkably similar. God forms Adam from the dust of the ground, the clay, and breathes the divine breath of life into his nostrils.
The Quran utilizes nearly identical imagery too, repeatedly stating that humans were fashioned from sounding clay, from molded mud, and infused with the spirit of Allah.
The raw materials are exactly the same, dirt and a divine spark. But the intent completely shifts the value of human life. We go from being created as expendable ditch diggers to alleviate the boredom of lazy gods, to being created as the pinnacle of a deliberate design, endowed with free will and tasked with being the stewards of the earth.
It represents a monumental elevation in how the human animal perceived its own dignity and moral responsibility.
But the parallels do not end with creation, they extend to destruction. The flood myth is perhaps the most famous narrative overlap in ancient history. Millennia before the biblical Noah built his ark, the Sumerians and Akkadians had their own flood survivors.
Depending on the specific cultural text you are reading, the hero is named Zisudra in Sumerian, Utnapishtim in Akkadian, or Atrahasis in older Babylonian versions.
Now, in the Hebrew Bible, God sends the flood because humanity has become irreparably wicked and violent. It is a profound moral judgment. But why did the Mesopotamian gods send their flood?
The Mesopotamian justification lacks any moral weight whatsoever. The human population had multiplied rapidly, and humans are inherently noisy. The din of the human cities reached the heavens and disturbed the sleep of the high god Enlil.
It was literally a cosmic noise complaint.
Yes. Enlil is so annoyed that he decides to eradicate the entire human race. But Enki, who engineered humans in the first place, has an affinity for his creations. He does not want them destroyed. However, the gods have sworn an oath of secrecy regarding the flood.
So Enki employs a brilliant legal loophole. He travels to the reed hut of his favored human, Utnapishtim. Enki does not speak directly to the man. Instead, he speaks to the reed wall of the hut, knowing the man is listening on the other side.
He says, "Reed wall, listen. Tear down your house, build a boat, abandon wealth, and seek survival. Take the seed of all living things aboard the ship."
He leaks the classified information to a wall. Utnapishtim builds a massive, multi-level cube of a boat, seals it with pitch, and loads his family and animals. The floodwaters hit. The storms rage for 6 days and 7 nights, obliterating everything.
Finally, the waters calm and the boat grounds itself on the peak of Mount Nemush. And then comes the sequence that truly proves the connection. What does Utnapishtim do to check if the land is dry?
He utilizes birds. First, he releases a dove. The dove finds no resting place and returns to the ship. Next, he releases a swallow, which also returns. Finally, he releases a raven. The raven finds receding water, eats, rests, and does not return.
It is the exact same sequence of birds that Noah uses in Genesis.
Exactly. And upon exiting the ark, Utnapishtim immediately offers a meat sacrifice. The Sumerian text features a vivid, somewhat pathetic image. The gods, having received no sacrifices during the flood, are starving. When they smell the roasting meat, they gather like flies around the offering.
In Genesis, Noah also builds an altar and offers a sacrifice upon leaving the ark. And the text notes that the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma and resolved never to curse the ground again because of humanity.
I try to imagine the sheer intellectual earthquake that occurred in the 19th century when archaeologists like George Smith were sitting in the British Museum translating these broken, dusty tablets recovered from Nineveh.
Oh, it must have been incredible.
They're reading a polytheistic text that is thousands of years older than the Bible, and suddenly they're reading the story of Noah's Ark down to the specific sequence of the birds.
It was a revolutionary moment for historical linguistics and biblical archaeology. But again, maintaining our objective lens, we must understand what this overlap signifies. It is highly probable that we are looking at the remnants of a massive shared cultural memory.
Like a literal historical mega flood.
Yes. Geological and archaeological data suggests that catastrophic, localized flooding occurred in the Mesopotamian basin, or perhaps the Black Sea region, in deep antiquity. The devastation to those early, fragile settlements would have been so absolute that the event became permanently etched into the cultural DNA of the region.
Over millennia, as different cultures evolved, they utilized this shared memory to teach entirely different theological lessons.
Exactly. The polytheists used it to explain the capricious, unpredictable nature of the gods and the environment. The monotheists used the exact same narrative architecture to explain the moral weight of human sin and the righteous judgment of a singular God.
The same foundational trauma processed through two entirely different ethical operating systems, which acts as the perfect transition into Section 4, the evolution of God and the problem of suffering. Because as these civilizations developed, their conception of the divine did not remain stagnant.
It evolved from the chaotic, hungry, squabbling gods of Sumer into the singular, transcendent creator found in later texts.
And we can track that evolution through the very vocabulary used to describe the divine. If we examine the names of God across these ancient texts, we uncover linguistic roots that branch across the entire Semitic world.
For instance, in the ancient polytheistic Canaanite religion, the neighbors of the early Israelites, the supreme father of the gods was named El. And when you open the Hebrew Bible, one of the most prominent, frequently utilized names for God is El, or its plural form, Elohim.
The linguistic continuity is undeniable. The Arabic word Allah originates from Alayla, which simply translates to the God. This shares the exact same Semitic root as the Hebrew word Eloah and Elohim.
And there's even a theoretical connection reaching into Egypt, correct?
Yes, though it remains a subject of debate among etymologists. In ancient Egyptian religion, the name of the supreme hidden god Amun, or Amun, was often elongated in liturgical chants. Some scholars theorize that because the ancient Israelites resided in Egypt, this vocalization may have influenced the development of the word Amen, utilized at the conclusion of prayers to signify truth or agreement.
Other scholars maintain Amen derives strictly from a Hebrew root. Regardless of that specific debate, the cross-pollination of language and religious concepts in the ancient Near East was constant and profound.
But we need to pause on the word Elohim, because this specific word is the source of a massive modern misconception. It is the linchpin for many of the alternative history theories we will discuss later.
Ah, yes, the Elohim grammatical fallacy.
It goes like this. People learn that in Hebrew, the suffix im denotes a plural noun. A single cherub becomes plural cherubim. Therefore, Elohim technically translates to gods, plural. So, individuals will read Genesis where it says, "Let us make mankind in our image." They look at the original Hebrew word Elohim and they declare, aha, the text is actually talking about a committee of gods, or perhaps a group of extraterrestrials, not a singular god.
It is a profoundly common error made by amateur linguists who isolate vocabulary from its grammatical ecosystem. They are ignoring how Hebrew syntax actually functions. Yes, the word Elohim is morphologically plural. It is shaped like a plural word. But the grammar surrounding it in the Hebrew Bible dictates a strictly singular meaning when referring to the God of Israel.
How does the surrounding grammar prove that?
Well, in Hebrew, just as in English or Spanish, the verbs must agree with the nouns in number. If Elohim meant a group of gods in these creation accounts, the verbs accompanying it would have to be conjugated in the plural. It would read, the gods were creating. However, in over 2,500 instances in the Hebrew Bible where Elohim refers to the creator, the associated verbs are emphatically singular. It translates literally as Elohim, he created. The syntax forces a singular interpretation.
So why use a plural-shaped word at all?
It is a linguistic convention known as the plural of majesty, or the plural of intensity. It denotes supreme greatness, not numerical quantity. And we know this wasn't unique to the Hebrews because we see the exact same phenomenon in neighboring older cultures.
Like where?
In the ancient Akkadian language, the word for gods is Ilanu. Yet, in the Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence from Canaanite kings to the Egyptian pharaoh, the writers frequently address the singular human pharaoh as my Ilanu, or my gods. They are employing a plural noun to emphasize the overwhelming singular power of the individual they are addressing.
That completely dismantles the multiple gods argument when you actually understand how the ancients communicated. So, as this concept of a singular, all-powerful God solidified, the ethical demands placed on humanity shifted dramatically. It wasn't just about feeding the gods with sacrifices anymore.
The ethical focus internalized. Hebrew theology introduced the vital concept of tzedek, which is translated as righteousness or justice. This wasn't merely about legal compliance, it was about living in a correct, covenantal relationship with the divine. It demanded ethical treatment of the poor, the widow, and the orphan.
But the evolution of this ethic was messy. Early on, they operated under a brutal concept known as corporate personality.
Right. Corporate personality is the belief that the family, or even the entire tribe, is a single, indivisible moral unit. If a grandfather committed a grievous sin, the cosmic stain of that sin remained, and his descendants, 3 or 4 generations later, could be legitimately punished for it by the divine.
It is a terrifying lack of individual autonomy. It's the ultimate sins of the father doctrine.
But the society couldn't sustain that indefinitely. It leads to intense fatalism.
Yeah, naturally.
Eventually, major theological reformers, particularly the prophet Ezekiel, violently rejected this concept. Ezekiel argued forcefully that a son should not bear the guilt of the father, nor the father bear the guilt of the son. He championed the concept of individual moral responsibility. The soul that sins is the soul that dies. You are judged solely on your own actions.
But introducing individual responsibility immediately creates a catastrophic philosophical problem. If God is entirely singular, completely powerful, and perfectly just, and I am only judged on my own actions, why do bad things happen to me when I act righteously? We slam face first into theodicy.
The problem of suffering. If the equation is righteousness equals blessing, then the existence of a starving, righteous person or a thriving, wicked tyrant suggests the equation is broken.
The Hebrew texts wrestle with this violently, and they offer radically different answers. Look at the book of Job. Job does everything perfectly. He's the pinnacle of individual righteousness, yet he loses his wealth, his children, and his health, all because of a cosmic wager. Job demands an audience with God to explain this injustice.
And the response Job receives provides no satisfying logical mechanism. God answers from a whirlwind and essentially subjects Job to a cosmic interrogation. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Can you bind the chains of the Pleiades?
The theological answer provided by Job is that the universe is unimaginably complex, God's architecture is beyond human comprehension, and the only appropriate human response to suffering is unquestioning obedience and awe.
That is a tough pill to swallow. And clearly not everyone accepted it, because sitting right next to Job in the text is the book of Ecclesiastes. And the author of Ecclesiastes sounds exactly like the cynical Egyptian harpist or the barmaid talking to Gilgamesh.
The author, adopting the persona of a phenomenally wealthy and wise King Solomon, conducts an empirical study of human existence. He analyzes wealth, pleasure, monumental building projects, and profound wisdom, and he concludes that it is all hevel, a Hebrew word meaning vapor, smoke, or vanity. It is a chasing after the wind.
He observes the core failure of the ethical equation, the exact same fate. The grave swallows the wise man and the fool, the righteous and the wicked.
He writes, "There is a vanity that takes place on earth, that there are righteous people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the wicked, and there are wicked people to whom it happens according to the deeds of the righteous."
He sees the injustice, and his conclusion is pure, pragmatic survival. He says, "Go, eat your bread with joy, and drink your wine with a merry heart. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love, all the days of your vain life. For there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol to which you are going."
It is a profound, almost nihilistic pragmatism. If ultimate justice does not exist in this life, and the afterlife is merely a dark silence, then the highest ethical good is to find simple, decent joy in your daily labor and your relationships today.
But a civilization cannot run on the gentle nihilism of Ecclesiastes forever. If the ethical system does not promise immediate reward in this life, you have to promise a delayed reward. Otherwise, why bother being righteous when being wicked is more profitable?
And that is where a massive historical collision changed everything: the Babylonian exile and the arrival of the Persian Empire.
This is a crucial pivot point in theological history. In the 6th century BCE, the Jewish elite were conquered and exiled to Babylon. Shortly thereafter, Babylon was conquered by Cyrus the Great of Persia. During this period of Persian dominion, Hebrew scholars came into deep, sustained contact with the state religion of the Persian Empire, Zoroastrianism.
So how does Zoroastrianism change the ethical mechanics?
Zoroastrianism introduced a radical new framework, cosmic dualism. Prior to this, the Hebrew God was responsible for everything, both the light and the darkness, the peace and the disaster. Zoroastrianism, however, posited an absolute ongoing cosmic war between two opposing forces.
Okay, who were they?
There was Ahura Mazda, the supreme creator of light, truth, and goodness, and opposing him was Angra Mainyu, the uncreated spirit of lies, darkness, and evil.
The introduction of a dedicated cosmic adversary, the devil.
Precisely. This provided a clean answer to the problem of theodicy. Why do bad things happen to good people? Because Angra Mainyu is active in the world and the universe is a battlefield. Humans are endowed with free will and must choose which side to align with.
But the most important piece of software Zoroastrianism installed was the concept of the Eschaton, the end times.
Yes, Zoroastrianism rejected the ancient idea that time was merely a repeating cycle of seasons. They proposed a linear view of history, moving relentlessly toward a final cataclysmic epoch where truth would ultimately defeat the lie. And crucially, in this end time, there would be a final universal judgment of every human soul.
Our sources detail the mechanics of this judgment. The Zoroastrians believed that after death, every soul had to cross the Chinvat Bridge, the bridge of separation.
It is a powerful metaphor. The soul must cross this bridge, which spans a river of molten metal. For the righteous soul, the bridge is wide and safe, and the molten metal feels like a warm, soothing bath. They pass into an eternal paradise.
But for the wicked soul, the bridge turns sideways, becoming as sharp as a razor, and they plunge into the molten metal to face destruction and punishment.
This fundamentally altered the Hebrew operating system. As we observe in later biblical texts, like the Book of Daniel, the ethical motivation shifts entirely. The focus moves from live a practical, decent life for today because tomorrow you die, to live a righteous life, endure the suffering now because absolute justice will be served in the eternal afterlife.
It was an incredibly successful theological adaptation. It provided a durable framework that could withstand the trauma of historical oppression. And it became the foundational bedrock for the eschatology of later Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
It really was.
That is a staggering intellectual journey. We have traced thousands of years of profound, agonizing human thought. We've seen brilliant people wrestling with mortality, trying to build functional societies, and seeking to understand the architecture of the cosmos. It is a testament to the sheer genius and resilience of the ancient mind. But well, here's where the story takes a sharp left turn into the surreal. Because in the modern era, a subset of the population has looked at these exact same magnificent, complex clay tablets, and they have come away with a completely different conclusion. They bypass the philosophy, they bypass the theology, and they arrive at pure science fiction.
We are, of course, referring to the theories of Zecharia Sitchin and the sprawling ancient astronaut mythology.
If you spend any time on YouTube or historical conspiracy forums, you have encountered this. In 1976, an author named Zecharia Sitchin published a massively influential book titled The 12th Planet. Sitchin proposed that when we read these Sumerian myths, like the creation of humans from clay and blood, or the Anunnaki gods requiring sacrifices, we are not reading metaphors.
Right, he claimed we were reading literal historical accounts of extraterrestrial contact.
Sitchin's core premise is that the gods of ancient Mesopotamia, the Anunnaki, were actually a race of flesh and blood humanoid aliens. He claimed they originated from a yet-to-be-discovered planet in our solar system named Nibiru, which he asserted possesses a massive, highly elliptical 3,600-year orbit.
According to Sitchin's timeline, the Anunnaki arrived on Earth roughly 400,000 years ago.
Why? Because the atmosphere on Nibiru was degrading. They needed to mine massive quantities of gold on Earth to suspend the gold dust in their atmosphere to reflect sunlight and save their planet.
A cosmic geoengineering project of unimaginable scale.
And this ties back perfectly to the myth of the DG strike we discussed earlier. Sitchin looks at that text and says, see, the alien miners got tired of digging for gold. So according to Sitchin, the alien chief scientist, Enki, decides to genetically engineer a disposable slave race to do the mining for them.
He essentially interprets the ancient poetic recipe of mixing clay and divine blood as a literal, technical description of in vitro fertilization and genetic manipulation occurring in an alien laboratory. He takes Anunnaki DNA, splices it with the DNA of an existing Earth hominid like Homo erectus, and engineers Homo sapiens.
I have to admit, purely as a narrative, it is an incredible pitch for a sci-fi franchise. It's essentially the plot of Stargate. And that explains its immense psychological appeal. It takes the terrifying mystery of human origins and the dense complexity of ancient history, and it provides a clean, highly technological, cinematic answer. It makes the past feel like a modern sci-fi movie.
It really does. But as millions of people believe this as literal truth, we need to apply the X-ray machine to these claims. Because from a linguistic, archaeological, and historical standpoint, how does Sitchin's work hold up?
Spoiler alert, it does not hold up. Under even basic academic scrutiny, Sitchin's methodology collapses entirely. It is a masterclass in linguistic manipulation and confirmation bias.
So let's dismantle this, piece by piece. Starting with the smoking gun. The alien homeworld, Nibiru.
Sitchin claimed the Sumerians had advanced astronomical knowledge and wrote extensively about this 12th planet. What do the actual cuneiform tablets say about Nibiru?
To answer that, we rely on the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, a monumental project that spent decades meticulously cataloging every known cuneiform text. When scholars examine every single instance where the word Nibiru appears in ancient astronomical texts, it is never not once described as a trans-Plutonian planet with a 3,600-year orbit.
If it's not a planet, what is it?
The root of the word implies a crossing or a transition. In the texts, Nibiru typically refers to a crossing point, a ferry boat, or a specific astronomical marker point in the sky. Depending on the specific text, it is most often associated with the planet Jupiter, the planet Mercury, or a pole star.
That completely undercuts his entire premise.
And this is the most critical point. In the thousands of tablets we possess detailing the mythology of the Anunnaki gods, they are never, in any context, associated with a place called Nibiru. Sitchin completely fabricated the connection between the gods and that specific astronomical term to create his narrative foundation.
But wait, I have to play devil's advocate here, representing the listener who has watched the documentaries. Sitchin supporters always point to visual evidence.
Yes, the cylinder seals.
Right. There is a very famous artifact, the cylinder seal VA-243, held in a museum in Berlin. It clearly shows a star in the center, surrounded by 11 smaller dots. Sitchin claims the central star is the sun, and the 11 dots are the planets and the moon. That makes 12 celestial bodies. Doesn't that prove the Sumerians knew about our entire solar system plus Nibiru?
Visual evidence requires visual context. Seal VA-243 is a classic example of isolating an artifact from its cultural ecosystem. Sitchin identifies the central symbol as the sun. However, we do not have to guess what the Sumerian symbol for the sun looks like.
We don't?
No, we have hundreds of steles, monuments, and seals that explicitly label the sun god, Utu or Shamash.
What does the actual sun symbol look like?
The established, universally recognized Mesopotamian sun symbol consists of a central circle with 4 distinct points and wavy lines radiating between those points, representing light and heat.
Oh, I see.
The symbol in the center of seal VA-243 does not possess those wavy lines. It has 6 or 8 points and is a completely different iconography. Scholars of ancient art identify it as a star symbol, likely representing a specific deity or constellation, not the sun. And if the central image is not the sun, then the entire solar system interpretation instantly disintegrates. The dots are merely stars, not planets orbiting a sun.
That is a devastating contextual correction. Okay, what about the aliens themselves? Sitchin heavily relies on tying the Mesopotamian Anunnaki to the Nephilim mentioned in the biblical book of Genesis. He claims that Nephilim literally translates to those who came down from above, or people of the fiery rockets.
This is perhaps his most egregious failure in basic linguistics. Sitchin claims that Nephilim is derived from the Hebrew root verb nafal, which means to fall.
Okay, so he's looking at the right root word.
He identifies the root, but then he arbitrarily forces a completely unnatural meaning onto it. He translates to fall as to deliberately come down in a vehicle.
That is quite a leap. How would a trained linguist translate it?
Given the specific morphological structure of the word in the Hebrew Bible, it can only be translated passively, those who are fallen. Depending on the context, this could mean warriors who have fallen in battle, or, more appropriately for the mythological context of Genesis 6, spiritually fallen or corrupt entities. It absolutely does not mean those who descend.
Wow.
Furthermore, our sources document a specific instance in one of Sitchin's books where he attempts to justify his translation by fundamentally confusing Hebrew grammar with Aramaic grammar. A first-year language student would fail an exam for that mistake. It proves he did not possess a functional understanding of the ancient languages he was claiming to decode.
So Nephilim does not mean rocket men. But speaking of rockets, this is where the theory reaches its most absurd peak. Sitchin claims that the ancient Mesopotamians were constantly talking about literal spacecraft.
Yes.
He points to the Sumerian word mu, the Akkadian word shumu, and the Hebrew word shem. He insists these words translate to rocket ship.
Yes, this is the crux of his technological argument. He applies this translation to the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. In Genesis, the people say, "Let us build a city and a tower, and let us make a Shem for ourselves." Sitchin argues that they were not building a tower, they were constructing a launch pad to build a Shem, a rocket ship.
How do we definitively prove the translation is wrong? Is it just modern scholars guessing better than Sitchin?
It involves zero guessing. We know exactly what those words mean because the ancient Mesopotamians left us their own dictionaries.
The ancient scribes wrote dictionaries.
Absolutely. The training of a Mesopotamian scribe required mastering both Sumerian, which was becoming a dead scholarly language, and Akkadian, the daily spoken language. To facilitate this, they created extensive bilingual lexical lists. They are essentially ancient Rosetta Stones.
And what do these ancient dictionaries say mu and shumu mean?
They define them clearly as name, reputation, or renown. When the builders of Babel wanted to make a Shem, they were trying to establish a great reputation for themselves, defying God's command to spread across the earth. They wanted to make a name for themselves.
Not a Saturn V rocket.
Precisely. And if we look at the parallel story in the Babylonian Enuma Elish, where the Anunnaki gods build a great tower for Marduk in Babylon, the text leaves no room for aeronautical interpretation. It explicitly details the construction process. 1 full year, they made its bricks. They built the high ziggurat.
They are building it with mud, bricks, and hose.
As I continually point out, you do not construct a spacecraft or a launch pad capable of withstanding rocket thrust out of sun-baked mud bricks. Sitchin simply ignores the surrounding verbs and materials described in the texts to force his technological narrative.
Which brings us to the final fatal blow to his theory. Let's return to the me from section 2. The kernel code of civilization. The list of attributes in Anastol.
Oh, this part.
Yeah. Sitchin claimed that when the text described Inanna putting on the me to fly in her boat of heaven, she wasn't gathering abstract concepts. He claimed the me were literal pieces of technology, spacesuits, helmets, or navigational gear for space travel.
Which demonstrates a total willful disregard for what the texts actually list.
It's hilarious if you actually read the primary sources.
Right.
If the me are components of an astronaut's spacesuit, in Houston we have a massive problem. Because according to the translated Sumerian inventory, Inanna is preparing for spaceflight by suiting up in kingship, scribeship, the craft of the leatherworker, strife, and mat weaving.
Not to mention securing the vital technological components of prostitution and the destruction of cities.
I am just picturing an Anunnaki astronaut on a spacewalk, trying to patch a breach in the hull using the art of metalworking and falsehood. The sheer absurdity of it highlights the fundamental flaw in Sitchin's entire enterprise. You cannot cherry-pick isolated words, mistranslate them, and ignore the surrounding paragraphs that explicitly define what those words mean.
That is the ultimate critique. The ancient astronaut theory relies entirely on ignoring grammatical rules, ignoring cultural context, ignoring the visual history of the artifacts, and ignoring the explicit definitions provided by the ancient scribes themselves. It is the projection of a 20th century science fiction fantasy onto the complex, profound reality of the ancient past.
It's time to bring this massive journey to a close. Let's synthesize what we've actually uncovered today. We started in the mud and the dust of the very first human cities. We watched humanity experience the shock of urbanization and struggle to invent a system of ethics, moving from the brutal, class-based ledger of Hammurabi's code to the profound existential realization in the Epic of Gilgamesh that our true legacy is the work we leave behind to protect the community.
We observe the stark contrast with Egypt, where the cosmic invisible law of Ma'at and the terrifying prospect of the afterlife dictated moral behavior, even while skeptics like the harpist urged people to simply enjoy the present moment.
We dove into the bizarre, realistic philosophy of the Sumerian me, realizing that our ancestors were wise enough to understand that civilization is an unbreakable package deal of both magnificent creation and horrifying destruction. And then we traced how those ancient polytheistic kernel codes, the creation from chaotic waters, the molding of humans from clay, the devastating flood, and the survivor's ark, were ported over and radically updated to shape the theology of the Hebrew Bible and the Quran.
We tracked the monumental evolution of the divine, moving from chaotic, competing forces into a singular moral creator. And we saw how the collision with the Persian Empire and Zoroastrianism introduced cosmic dualism and the concept of an ultimate eternal judgment to answer the agonizing, universal problem of human suffering.
And finally, we confronted how modern society, desperate for an easy cinematic origin story, has allowed individuals like Zecharia Sitchin to twist those same magnificent texts into a deceptive narrative about alien gold miners.
The value of objective truth here cannot be overstated. We do not need to invent extraterrestrials to make ancient history fascinating. The genuine historical record, humanity's slow, agonizing, beautiful struggle to understand its own mortality, to construct functional, just societies, and to find meaning in a seemingly silent cosmos, is infinitely more compelling and far more profound than any pulp science fiction conspiracy.
Yeah, the brilliance of our ancestors is evident in their own words. Attributing their monumental achievements to aliens strips them of their agency and their genius. It's an insult to the people who actually stacked those bricks and carved those tablets. We are the architects of our own civilization, for better or worse.
Well said.
So as we bring this deep dive to a close, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to turn over in your mind. Think deeply about why the ancient astronaut theory remains so incredibly popular today, despite being thoroughly debunked. Are we really that psychologically different from the ancient Sumerians? Thousands of years ago, humanity was terrified of a chaotic, unpredictable world, floods, disease, famine. So they invented the Anunnaki. They projected powerful, flawed, human-like entities into the sky to explain the chaos.
Right. They desperately needed to believe that some higher power was at least in control of the myth, the operating system of the universe, even if that power was cruel.
Exactly. Today, we live in a rapidly changing, increasingly technological, and intensely terrifying world. We face existential threats of our own making. Perhaps the ancient alien myth is simply our modern version of the exact same psychological safety blanket. Because maybe, deep down in the human psyche, we actually prefer the idea of an advanced alien overseer pulling the strings. Because the alternative, the terrifying realization that we humans are entirely alone on this rock and entirely solely responsible for our own destiny and our own survival, is just too heavy a burden to bear. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. We will see you next time.